Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
Good morning, Ben. How are you today?
I am a little tired, but doing well. I was up late last night ordering Legos.
A little tired. It's never too early for Mountain Dew.
I know. Well, I had my coffee. But yeah, the new Lego set, the Apollo 11 Saturn V Lego kit was released last night, so I may have stayed up till 1:15 trying to order that. Took me about an hour and 20 minutes of the Lego site not responding, timing out, crashing, all of that before I finally got my order in.
Web and be hard. I've been working on my Poe Dameron X-Wing.
Oh, how's that one going?
It's going. If I could ever stop playing video games, I might actually get it done.
One can only dream, have high, lofty aspirations of productivity.
Yeah, it's really hard. Why don't we talk about some other ways that we can be productive with Office 365 today?
All right. So how about we talk about some PowerShell with Office 365? This is one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, a little bit of posh, huh?
Yeah, exactly. You can never go wrong with some posh.
Cool. So why would somebody want to use PowerShell with Office 365?
So there's a few reasons. A couple of my key reasons for using PowerShell with Office 365 or really anything is some consistency, reliability with anything in the GUI. There's always mistakes you can make. You can click the wrong button when you're setting something up, when you're setting up some users. I know when you have multiple domains, you always have the default, but there's things you could do with domains. There's a whole bunch of ways you could click something wrong and not have a consistent configuration across users, maybe across certain settings, even across tenants. If you have different tenants and you want some of the same settings set in different tenants, if you write a PowerShell script, you can keep it nice and consistent. Write the script, point it to a new tenant, run it, and everything's going to run the same.
Very cool. So, really, it's that just if you're going to do it more than once, let's try and automate it, right?
Yep, exactly. And then the other reason is there are actually a few things you cannot do in the GUI in Office 365. Especially, again, going back to the users, there's some bulk updates that if you want to apply it to a whole bunch of users or apply maybe a mailbox setting to a whole bunch of mailboxes, there's no real way to do it in bulk in the browser. If you're using PowerShell, you can pass in a CSV file. You can run it through an array.
You mentioned Exchange. So, there's a bunch of different components in Office 365, right? We've talked about SharePoint and Exchange and Skype and Yammer and this, that, and the other thing. Are there any limitations on what I can manage in PowerShell, or are there kind of core verticals that people should be looking at?
So there's definitely some core verticals. And before we get too far into this, there's a really good website if you're getting started with PowerShell that's just for PowerShell and Office 365. So we'll put it in the show notes, but PowerShell.office.com is out there, and it's a getting started for PowerShell and Office 365. They have some sample scripts out there, some example scripts, some of the things you may need to do to get it configured on your local machine to connect, because unlike SharePoint on-prem where you had to be on the local server, with PowerShell for Office 365, you run it from your local machine. So there's some things you have to do to get set up there. Great website to get started. But like you said, once you get started, you have a few different components. Like we've said, as we talked in other episodes, you have your Azure AD part of Office 365. You have your Exchange component of Office 365. You have your SharePoint component of Office 365, Skype for Business, even some of those other components like Azure Rights Management. With all of those, you actually connect and write PowerShell a little bit differently for all of them. So like Azure AD actually requires you to go out, download a module, install a module, go that route to get the commandlets that you need to actually run those PowerShell commands. Exchange Online doesn't require anything. Exchange Online just uses a remote PowerShell session to the Exchange Online environment. So no modules to install, nothing. You just establish your remote session. Microsoft gives you all the commandlets to do that, and you're off and running for Exchange. SharePoint, again, they have another set of commandlets. You have to download the module there, install that to get those commandlets. And then Skype for Business is weird. It's kind of like a pseudo remote connection. You still have a module you have to go and install, but there's only I think there's only a handful of commandlets in that module. And all those commandlets do is establish a remote session to Skype for Business online.
Yeah, there's some of the other ones that do that too, like Exchange. So one of the things that you often run into with, connectivity is it's not just you have to install these things, but you have to sign in too, right? And there's a bunch of authentication models that come into play. So there's things like I could be a cloud-only account. I could be maybe a directory synchronized user with my username and password in Azure AD, or I could leverage something like federation with ADFS or ping federate. And then if I federate, or if I'm doing one of those other models, maybe I do other things like MFA. And that used to be really hard to go ahead and get in with some of that stuff. But I think everything that you mentioned so far, so Azure AD, Exchange, SharePoint, Skype, they all support multi-factor authentication now as well.
So I believe Exchange still doesn't.
Exchange does. You have to go into
Oh, that's right. There's a different way to do it than storing your credentials.
Yeah, it's kind of like Skype. You go into the Exchange Admin Center, you go into Hybrid, and you click Setup, and then it installs a little local PowerShell module for you locally. And then rather than having to remember that whole long URI to connect to Exchange, you do things like just connect EXO PS session, and boom, you're off and running. Give it a UPN and you're in.
Yes, I have not used that EXO one as much. I always forget about that because I'm so used to just grabbing that string.
Yeah, we use MFA quite a bit. So the management plane's been hard for a while, and we're slowly transitioning everybody over to the newest, latest tooling to get everybody up and running in there. You mentioned a bunch of different things. One thing I didn't hear, is there any PowerShell for Yammer?
I don't believe so. I've never seen any. Have you ever seen any PowerShell for Yammer?
Listen, I'm the one that asks the questions here.
I know.
No, well, there's no official PowerShell for Yammer, but PowerShell does have a REST API. So if you want to get all developer-y and just interact with the REST API through PowerShell, you can go ahead and make that happen. And then one of the other ones that's kind of hidden away, I don't necessarily consider it a core thing today, but the Protection Center, so the Security and Compliance Center, protection.office.com, if you want to do things like manage e-discovery cases and content searches and other things, there's a separate URI that you can connect to through that pulls down some additional Exchange commandlets and lets you manage those cases and queries and things like that.
Yeah, and that I know that's kind of goofy because I've even done some of that too. Like they have the unified audit log out there right now that spans all of the products. It tracks audits activities in Skype for Business, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, but all of those commandlets are technically part of the Exchange Online PowerShell.
Yeah, and they're a weird part of the Exchange Online PowerShell. It's really connecting to a different endpoint. And then you'll run into things, there's not always one endpoint to rule them all across, these various things. So Exchange is the biggest one that comes to mind for me because it's got that security and compliance stuff, like you said, to get to unified audit or e-discovery, content searches. There's also some things that you run into. Have you ever tried to set a user's profile photo in Office 365? So do like a set user photo kind of thing?
I have not tried that one yet.
All right. So if you ever try that, one of the things you're going to run into is the default PowerShell connection, that PowerShell remoting session to Exchange, because again, those user photo things are part of Exchange. Why wouldn't they be? When you go in and you go ahead and set all that up, you'll try and run your photo through the first time, and it'll go ahead and bomb out and yell at you and say, it's too big, I can't get it up here, it's over 10 kilobytes, and then you think, well, how small and granulated does it have to be to get down to that size? There's actually a query string that you can throw onto those remoting sessions to allow like larger file transfers or really more like data streams to go up so that you can do things like user photos. So, the lesson is there's probably 3 or 4 different ways to get into any one of these things, no matter how you wanted to go about it.
It's just like everything. You and I both grew up in SharePoint. land. When someone asks you how to do something, your response is just, it depends.
Yeah. Classic SharePoint answer.
Yes, there's 4, 5, 6 ways to do everything you want to do. So as you're working with these commandlets too, one thing that can be a little tricky is how do you actually know what commandlets are for the different products? Like, again, going back to SharePoint, because that's where both you and I came from. On-prem, everything was SP. So it was get SP web, get SP site, get SP list, set SP list, all of those. Once you start getting into Office 365, there is no common preface to the noun part of the commandlet. So there isn't a get O365 mail or get O365 mailbox. It actually varies product to product. So Azure AD, we mentioned this in one of our other episodes. Everything is Azure AD if you're on the new V2. It's a MSOL if you're on the older V1. So it's going to be get MSOL user or get Azure AD user, or sometimes Azure AD directory. Once you get into Exchange, there is nothing. Because you're doing that remote session, they all use the same commandlets that were available for Exchange Online. So it's just get mailbox or get whatever, set whatever. It's using those same commandlets that you would use with an on-prem Exchange environment. So there is no phrase, no few letters prefacing the noun there. Once you get into SharePoint Online, they went with SPO for SharePoint Online. And we'll get into that a little more. There's some other cool PowerShell stuff around the SharePoint side of things. And then Skype for Business is all CS. I'm guessing that still comes from the days of communication server is what the CS stands for. But don't look for a S for B or Skype or anything like that. All those commandlets tend to have a get-CS, set-CS, something along those lines. So as you're going out looking for all of those, be aware that it can be kind of hard to narrow down what all those commandlets actually are.
Yeah, I used to struggle with that one, but I don't think it's the end of the world so much anymore because you do effectively launch into different shells most of the time. So unless you've gone ahead and set up a custom profile to kind of bootstrap into everything at once, when you want to go into Azure AD, you're going to open up a PowerShell command prompt and you're going to specifically import that module. Or when you do Exchange, you're remoting specifically into an Exchange session. So you've kind of got it in your head that these are the commandlets I'm going to be using. This is where I need to be and what's going on. SharePoint's an interesting one. Like you said, it's a little bit different. There's a lot of limitations, and there have been for a while in the built-in kind of Microsoft delivered SharePoint commandlets. So there's some third-party ones that are out there, like PNP PowerShell comes to mind, that make it a little bit easier to go ahead and interact with some of that stuff. PNP PowerShell is an interesting one. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know you do a bit with it.
Sure. So PNP PowerShell, in my mind, is a must-have if you're going to do anything with SharePoint Online and PowerShell. The way I kind of look at it is if you look at those built-in SharePoint commandlets, I think they've added a few, but there were less than 100 commandlets for the SharePoint Online built-in commandlets from Microsoft. You compare that to SharePoint On-Prem, where I think it's over 800. It's like 830 some, 850 some. So you get the idea that there's a big gap there. Kind of the way I like to describe it is SharePoint Online ones, the one that Microsoft gives you that are built in, are mainly for, I would almost say more administering your tenant, viewing a list of all the site collections, setting resource quotas on the site collections, controlling maybe some of the sharing settings on site collections with external users, but not so much working with list items, working with libraries, adding, updating list items, that type of stuff. So out there, and we'll link to this in the show notes, there's these PNP commandlets. It's a repo out on GitHub. It's run by Microsoft, but everybody, the community contributes to it. They essentially have written several hundred commandlets, all leveraging the client-side API. that gives you all of that functionality that, or not all of it, most of the functionality you're used to when writing PowerShell on-prem. So it has stuff for enabling features, disabling features. They have some nice ones even around provisioning OneDrive for Business so that you can pre-provision the OneDrive for Business site for your users. They have some nice commandlets too, even around site provisioning. So if you want to create a site template, they have a commandlet that you could create a site template. It's essentially an XML definition of a site and use their commandlets to provision your sites. So it's a whole wealth of commandlets specifically for more working with sites, working with content within the sites. A lot of that stuff that you used to do just with the out-of-the-box SharePoint commandlets in an on-premises environment.
Nifty. And you told people you weren't going to turn them into a developer.
Yeah, I know. There's a fine line.
Yeah, well, way to go ahead and break that contract.
One more thing on those, they used to be a little goofy because they actually started off using that SPO2. So you would actually have get SPO site from the PNP commandlets and get SPO site from the built-in commandlets, and you'd have to delineate between the two when you were writing scripts. It got really messy. So recently they have updated all of those, so they're not SPO anymore. They are now going to be PNP, and the SPO is either depreciating very soon or already has. So if another one of those, or if you wrote a bunch of old scripts using that module and haven't updated it, go make sure you update it, because eventually those SPO ones aren't going to work. You're going to have to switch everything over to PNP.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do that all the time, right? We go from MSOL to Azure AD and get SPO to, all the other stuff. So yeah. It's one of those things that always comes up. One of the things that I think always comes up a little bit too is, we've been talking a little bit about automation, and really it's about how to connect and do these kind of like one-off context things, right? Like I want to get a mailbox or set something on somebody's calendar, create a SharePoint site, or, add a site collection admin, something like that. When you get into automating some of these things, then you get into the weird world of, well, now I have to do credential storage, and where do those things run from, and how do I do that? You want to talk a little bit about that, kind of how you do that in kind of day-to-day practice?
Yeah. There's a few different ways you can do it, actually. One of them is there's some PowerShell out there. I think I might have some in my GitHub repo. I know Shane Young has a PowerShell video a YouTube video out there on some of this as well. But one way you can do it is you can actually store credentials in an encrypted text file right on the computer. So this is encrypted, locked down to the user that creates it, so nobody else could actually log into your machine, see what's in the text file. It's a fairly secure way to store passwords just in a text file on the hard drive of the computer. And then when you want to go automate this, run a PowerShell command, go out, grab the text file, decrypt it, send the password off. Or I don't even know if you necessarily decrypt it, because it still stays as a secure string. But you take that secure string, send it off, connect. The other way you can do it is, I think the PNP ones I know do. I'm not sure about all the built-in ones, but you can actually store credentials in the Windows Credential Manager. So go save those credentials for connecting to your SharePoint environment, or Exchange, Azure AD, any of those, and that Windows Credential Manager. And then when you run those commands, just go grab those credentials out of Windows Credentials Manager, shove them into the PowerShell, throw it up there. So this prevents having to actually store passwords in plain text right within your PowerShell script. So somebody could find them, use them to log into your environment in the GUI, that type of stuff. So again, a couple different ways to just securely store that password, so that you can just quickly pull it up, have it right there for automation.
Cool. Are there any kind of limitations on those credentials? So, it's hard to automate something like MFA and having a token pop up in an interactive session for something you want to be non-interactive. But should I be using cloud-only accounts? Can I use federated accounts like ADFS? Are there limitations there with doing some of the get credential and passing those objects around?
Yes, definitely. There's one I found the other day. Microsoft said this was by design. I've actually gotten some conflicting reports on how this works, if this works. Maybe it has to do with people on different tenants. But one of my clients, we're using ADFS, so federated accounts. We did not have MFA turned on, but we were storing the credentials. So we would store local AD credentials, pass them into a credential variable, and then use that to connect to our tenant. Again, that was all set up to use ADFS. All of a sudden, one day, it just randomly started failing. Failed for anything. Azure AD Exchange, SharePoint. I opened a ticket with Microsoft, and they actually confirmed it. They said, yep, if you store ADFS credentials in a variable in PowerShell and then try to log in using those, it's going to fail. It's by design. You're out of luck. Go create a cloud-only account and use that to connect. Again, I've heard some conflicting stories. I put a blog post out there about it, talked to some people. Some people have said, no, it should still work. Other people have said, yes, I see the same thing. Give it a try. But all that to be said, my recommendation, if you're going to be doing a bunch of PowerShell and automation, is just do a cloud-only account. Maybe turn off MFA for it and come up with the most secure password you can. But my experience has been, for writing PowerShell, doing a cloud-only account that does not have MFA on, you're going to have your highest level of success, least amount of just random errors due to some change if you go that route.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that one. I think a lot of people forget when they go ahead and do things like federation that they can continue to have things like cloud-only accounts to make their lives easier. And it's definitely one of those where it makes your life easier. So you can still go ahead and lock things down. Like you said, do secure credential storage. You've got a full audit log of all those actions. So you might have some additional monitoring in place just to make sure that that stuff's not, leaking out there or anything like that. But if you want to be successful with it, it's kind of one of your kind of go-to paths to get up there and running.
Yep. And make sure you give it adequate permissions too. Don't just create a user and don't make it a global admin or a product admin. Got to make sure you actually give that user permissions to access all of that information as well.
Yeah, permissions? What?
Yeah.
Never happens. So we got a couple minutes left. Is there anything that's kind of a go-to thing for you that you find yourself either automating a lot? Like, is there a scenario that you've just kind of keyed in and latched on? Like, I can think for myself, in our tenants, we do things like user license reporting quite a bit. So I always want to understand, just from an adoption and consumption side of things, as we assign licenses to users, what services have been deployed, what have they gone in and turned on. For instance, there were licensing changes to Power BI announced a couple weeks ago. So, to understand that organizational impact, I really wanted to go out and see, well, how many users have actually signed into Power BI? How many have provisioned a license? How many have kind of gone through that flow and done all the steps to get there? So I find myself doing stuff like that a lot. It sounds like you do a little bit with SharePoint quite a bit, right? So are you doing a lot of site creation, or is there, just a go-to or a favorite for you?
Yeah, I have two go-tos. One of them is the SharePoint, the site creation. Again, for me, I have a lot of clients that talk about, even from a governance perspective, if you let users just go out and create sites on their own, do whatever they want to on sites, create subsites, create a bunch of document libraries, you can run into some issues around content types, being very specific in which content types are in which libraries, making sure users are assigning content types to documents they upload. And even from a support standpoint, if you want to train your service desk to help with basic support issues, especially around SharePoint, having consistent sites for all of your teams, consistent document libraries, consistent content types, makes it a lot easier from an administration standpoint. So if you can use PowerShell to automate that whole site provisioning process to get a very consistent feel across all of your team sites, collaboration sites, it really helps with governance as well as support. And the other one that I find myself going to a lot is what you said, working with users in Azure AD, your users in Office 365. I know now they have some of that group licensing where we talked about it before. You can add users to a group, they automatically get licensing. But before that, doing a lot of stuff around what license do they have, assigning licenses, making sure that when Microsoft rolled out a new feature that the license was enabled by default, just firing off a script to go out and turn that off for a bunch of people. And one I've been working on with a client too is that OneDrive provisioning. They wanted to roll it out to about 3,000 users. They said, hey, we want these users just to have a OneDrive license to pre-provision it. So when they first go to it, they don't get, please wait while we create your site. So I just created a loop, went through, licensed everybody for OneDrive for Business, spun up about 3,000 OneDrive for Business sites. I actually booted up a Windows 10 VM in Azure, let it run up in Azure, because it takes a little while. Again, you're doing CSOM, you're not doing server side, so there's some latency there. If you're doing it on a VM in Azure, it's a little quicker. They're a little closer, staying on Microsoft's network. But that's another big one. Running those PowerShell commandlets to provision OneDrive sites and work with licensing.
Very good. Well, I think we're almost to the end because I'm out of Mountain Dew. And I still have Legos sitting to the side of me that need to be put together.
And I need to go get some more coffee. I haven't had much of a chance to drink it during this one. You kept me busy talking.
Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Scott. Another good one on PowerShell. We'll talk to you next week. We'll come up with another topic. Again, if any of you guys have any ideas, any topics you want to hear, drop us a comment, hit us up on Twitter. Let us know what you want us to talk about.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Scott. And we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
Bye-bye. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and